coming up.
Mr. Seidman, you talked about there's no Trump-proofing NATO. Can you expand on that?
On the issue of Trump perhaps taking these elections, and
I'd like to get back to Trump.
I won't say it now, but I'd like to have an opportunity at some point to say things about Trump.
I have another question for you. Actually, I had one, but I'll let you go on with what you were going to say to us about Trump and the extreme right.
I was fascinated with your comments regarding Trump, and I've watched with some fascination in terms of what's happening around the world with disinformation. And
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
All right. Firstly, for Madam Kemp, Minister Blair announced in February of this year $46 million to acquire new counter-drone equipment for Latvia to defend against Class 1 drones. Is this new system sufficient to detect and destroy incoming Russian Lancet kamikaze drones? And then I asked Ms. Kemp from RAND that question.
Oh, do I respond right now?
Yes, please.
Or, okay, so I cannot tell you off the top of my head specifically what type of drone it will be effective against. What I do want to say that, in fact, when I spoke about the capabilities that Baltic states really need assistance with, they are working on counter-drone capabilities, but assistance in terms of counter-drone capabilities is very important. And here, I mean, counter drones against a number of different types of drones, starting from very small ones, because those can be used, as we know, also to do attacks. We see plenty of those examples from both sides in Ukraine, in the war in Ukraine, to all the way to much larger, much more sophisticated, complicated drones as well. So Shahid would be sort of, let's say, a bigger one. So here, I would say the counter-drone capability is needed across the spectrum.
What kind of drone was recovered in Latvia? Was that a kamikaze or surveillance?
She's muted. You went on mute. I think you just put yourself on mute.
Yeah, so that was the Iranian Shahid drone. And I understand. So Shahid drone is basically like a loitering munition type of unmanned aerial system. So you may refer to it as also as a kamikaze drone or as a suicide drone, right? It's basically an autonomous flying weapon. So that is what was recovered in Latvia. Investigation is still ongoing, so we only know what has been in the media.
Thank you.
We know that they have recovered it there.
Okay, Mr. Arel, the lack of ground-based long-range anti-air capabilities like Patriot missiles or NASAMS for our troops, especially defending Latvia, vulnerable to the high-altitude aircraft like Tu-160 and the Tu-95 bombers, cruise missiles, and hypersonic missiles. How can we defend ourselves from these threats without any plan from our government to acquire long-range SAMs to counter these threats?
Is the question related to the Baltics or to Ukraine?
To Latvia.
To Latvia. I cannot really address the Latvia situation. I'll leave that to my colleagues.
All right.
Address Ukraine.
Would Mr. Seidman be able to address that?
I can try. I would say that the Latvia situation is a multilateral effort, and so we would be depending on our allies for the help in air defense. The United States has air defense capabilities in the region. The British, the Germans have some capabilities. The benefit of the Baltics regions, it's small, so the threats that are facing us are not only facing us, but they're facing our allies in the region. So we don't have the capability. They're currently trying to reinvest in that capability. But no, we don't have that ability ourselves at this moment.
So this may be for Mr. Arel. There's also the ground-based air defense project, GBAD, that claims to defeat threats posed by rockets, artillery, mortar munitions, air-to-surface missiles, and drones, with attack aircraft and helicopter relegated to second targets. Why hasn't our government seen the need to counter threats from high-altitude bombers, given their ability to launch cruise missiles and, more worryingly, hypersonic? And that would apply to Canada as well as Latvia.
What I can say regarding Canada from my Ukraine vantage point, I don't see a political will really to engage, to make major changes in what Canada can provide abroad and what Canada can produce for itself, as you referred to. So Canada promised 20 or 21 months ago a system in the family of Patriot systems, and it still has not been delivered. There's been decisions or non-decisions regarding budget reallocations for the military. We are familiar with the problem. Canada's a laggard in the infamous 2% threshold, and that's been 2.5 years going. So from a Ukraine perspective, Canada is not alone. There's a lot of promises are made, but then the delivery is very slow. And the reality right now is Ukraine cannot defend itself against these systematic attacks. That's the escalation. The escalation is Russia is doing more and more and more of these attacks on civilian targets, which is why the strategy in Ukraine has to be now dual, to change, not just to expect how can we defend ourselves while we're being destroyed, but to go on the offense.
Mr. Seidman, you talked about there's no Trump-proofing NATO. Can you expand on that in probably 30 seconds now?
Sure. The challenge of NATO is that the heart of it is the Article 5, an attack upon one is equal to attack upon all. He's made it very clear that he's not very concerned about that, and he has talked about making it contingent on 2%. Now we have his VP candidate talking about it being contingent on other dynamics related to immigration and other strange things. It's clear they don't take NATO very seriously, and they spent a lot of time in the last time around trying to educate Trump about NATO, and he was pretty ruthless about not learning those lessons. And he has a lot of resentment towards NATO because he remembers not feeling very comfortable at all the summits and not being a member of the club. And he is a man animated almost entirely by resentment, so it doesn't portend well for the organization. And he was always opposed. I mean, his first campaign commitments in 2015 was about being anti-NATO.
Thank you, Ms. Lafayette.
On the issue of Trump perhaps taking these elections, and what about the other countries around Ukraine? What about the EFPs, deterrence operations? I'm thinking of Poland, where there's a strong American presence. Poland has gotten to 2%, in fact, gone beyond 2% of GDP. I mean, those countries are actually doing what Trump is wanting them to do in a way, and can we expect that the American support will be maintained?
I would say even those countries that spend 2% should not expect the support of Trump. He creates lots of uncertainty about everything, and the whole idea of NATO for 70 years was to try to create some certainty about the American commitment to Europe. So perhaps the most controversial thing I could say about this is that if Trump becomes president, I would expect Poland to seriously consider nuclear proliferation, because they can't count on the American nuclear umbrella with the Trump presidency, and nobody's counting on the French or the British nuclear weapons to be extended to deter attacks upon the Baltics. They would be on their own to a certain degree. The history of the European Union trying to develop significant international cooperation to be a replacement for NATO has failed. Now, maybe the impetus of having the United States no longer being a committed defender to Eastern Europe would encourage that. But I think if you talk to people in the region, they don't have a lot of faith in the European Union standing up if NATO were to become less effective or become irrelevant.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. A question for you, Madam Keppe. I'd like to get back to the issue of conscription. I'll ask the question quickly. What is the state of mind, if you will, of the various Baltic states? I don't think Estonia has conscription yet, and is that being considered? And also, what is the perception in the public? Have things changed as the conflict extends in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. So all three Baltic states by now have conscription. Estonia never actually said goodbye to its conscription. It has had it since early 1990s when they regained independence. And in fact, we now have, the Baltic states and also the Nordic countries all have some sort of a total defense or whole of society defense system where civilian contribution to defense, national defense and security is paramount to those systems. So conscription, and Lithuania had basically had a sort of hybrid conscription system, which they also went back to a sort of fuller type of conscription already earlier. In terms of population support for conscription or national service, when Latvia only reintroduced it a year or so ago, there always tends to be some sort of concern whether the population will be fine with it, whether people will actually be happy to serve. What they have done, what we see also in some other countries that are trying to reintroduce conscription, is that at first there actually is a lot of interest. So the first
unfortunately, Madame Normandine has gone way past her time.
I'd like to get back to Trump, because that's always actually, it's more about that connection of what we're seeing within NATO allies now, of that movement, the far right being specifically linked to very pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian sentiment. We're seeing it with America. We're seeing it with Hungary a bit now, which is concerning, of course. Could you expand on that in terms of describing that link, why that exists?
That's a really good question. There's a variety of links between the far right and the Russian government. The Russian government has engaged in significant disinformation efforts that have been facilitating the far right. Why does the far right find Putin attractive? Part of the far right's endeavor is to delegitimize existing institutions, and they also proto-authoritarian, and so they find Putin's efforts to be helpful, and they find Putin to be a model. That they want to have an authoritarian regime that's far right. They're anti-democratic. Viktor Orban has been at the forefront of this. That Hungary has led the movement on democratic backsliding. He's been fond of talking about illiberal democracy. He's been very fond of using homophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hatred to mobilize support for his regime and to undermine his opponents, and to do that in the neighborhood as well. And that playbook has been imitated by far-right politicians in Europe and North America. It's not an accident these days that trans people are demonized. It's not an accident that anti-Semitism is rising. It's not an accident that Islamophobia is rising. All these things travel together, and Putin's ideology is very, very similar to the ideology by the far-right political movements in the United States, Canada, and Europe.
Does NATO have any sort of actual defense to that within its own internal structures?
Yes and no, in that they have spent a fair amount of time thinking about disinformation, right? So they have a strategic communications center of excellence in Latvia. They've been talking about disinformation for quite some time, but the problem is, I had a graduate student work on this, that foreign election interference and that stuff depends crucially on domestic allies. So it really depends on the domestic politics of each member of NATO about whether the right-wing parties will fight against the far right or ally with them. And we've seen mixtures of this, one way or the other, and it makes a big difference which side the right-wing parties take on this stuff.
I mean, this certainly isn't anything that isn't new to Canada as well. In terms of even just like last week, we saw that far-right startup. It's called Tenet Media. It was the front for Putin propaganda. They've been promoting very anti-Ukrainian messages. They do so about vaccines, residential schools, like you said, anti-LGBTQ plus attacks, anti-trans attacks. They're making videos. They're combining with Rebel Media does the same. True North does the same. We know, so that's part of that larger strategy. What responsibility do we have here in Canada to defeat that internally as well. How do we do that in a nutshell? Right? In a few
in
minutes.
the 30 seconds I have left.
You have more than that. I'll give you my time.
Yeah, I think this is the central question of our day, right? Because there's political temptations by any party to criticize other parties for whatever stance they're taking. And the challenge of our political system is adversarial, so it's very hard to get all the parties on the same side about the fact that there are malevolent actors out there who are trying to use our divides against us. It requires the current government be more transparent about what's been going on, and it requires the opposition parties to ask the right questions, ask good questions about the quality of government response to these things, but also not to undermine, for instance, existing oversight bodies. So NISICOP, NISIRA, those kinds of things are supposed to build faith in our oversight of our intelligence apparatus. And so we need to be more careful about playing politics with those organizations. The question is, how much can our politicians come together and talk about this stuff? We had a pretty good response in 2021 during that election about election interference. So the question is, in the next election, can we have the parties agree to rules about how to deal with outsiders trying to affect things? We have some parties supporting conservative candidates. We have some outsiders, supporting conservative candidates. We have some outsiders supporting liberal candidates. It's not like any one party benefits or is hurt by foreign election interference. They're all hurt by it. It hurts our system, which, it decreases the trust in the system, which then means that far-right parties then end up getting maybe more support. Luckily, that hasn't really happened here yet, but it has to be where each party polices its own, and we also have to expect better efforts by the media not to legitimize the news stories that come out of far-right folks, that we can't have this false equivalence where, True North says this and the New York Times says that, so therefore the truth is somewhere in between. It's not. So we need to be more careful about what we amplify, what we platform.
Do any of the political parties have those internal mechanisms adequately? Like, is there a way to strengthen those internal mechanisms with any party? Do they have them, to your knowledge?
Very briefly, please, Ms. Masson, is past your time.
I don't know the internal machinery of any of the parties. I don't know whether what they have, but it's something they need to take seriously.
I want to talk about the general state of repair of our equipment in Latvia. It seems in Canada a lot of things are broken, and is the equipment we have in Latvia, can you comment on the general state of repair of that equipment there?
I can't speak to the very specifics of it. I think generally we send our best equipment to the field. And I would say that in my conversations with the folks I had in the battle group, the reports about various things are a bit overstated in terms of the lack of resources. I think the bigger challenge in Latvia, our forces in Latvia, is they simply don't have as much ammunition to practice the art of war. And that's what they're really lacking, not really that their equipment is inferior.
And in that case, if we don't have inferior equipment, we're also able to repair it on our own and not rely on allies for that supply chain.
I can't speak to the specifics of the supply chain, but again, the idea of the alliance is we're supposed to be interoperable. We're supposed to be able to have our allies help us do things. We don't, the way the battle group is organized is that we don't have Canadians in every position because we have allies in some of these positions. So some of the maintenance of this stuff is maybe done through allied supply chains, and that's not a bad thing.
Okay, we talked about 1,500 troops every 6 months. That's 3,000 troops a year. Do we have the regular forces and the reservists to supplement that at a trained and ready condition?
I think we do in the short term. The challenge is that it becomes a recruiting and retention problem because the troops want to have new and different experiences. And so people are now on their second, third, fourth tours. And so in the long run, this has become stressful. We have enough bodies for this at the moment, but the challenge is how do we make the mission easier, more attractive, more engaging, so that way that becomes a recruitment tool as opposed to an impediment for recruitment.
Right, and does that leave us vulnerable at home if all of our assets are directed towards one expeditionary mission?
No, because, I mean, our other adversary that we think of as China, and our army is not really designed to fight a war with China. It would not be called upon to send troops to China. Our Air Force and our Navy are more positioned towards the Pacific, so I think the division of labor kind of makes sense. Our army is dedicated to the land war, to potential land war in Europe, and our Navy and Air Force are mostly pointed elsewhere.
Do you have more time? Okay. Where do we stand versus other countries with respect to our contribution to the Ukraine war?
I don't have the latest statistics on this. I think we're probably in the middle of the pack. There are lots of countries that made bigger promises than us and haven't delivered. We've made a fair amount of commitments. Is it proportional to our economy compared to the other folks? Probably we could be doing a bit more, but again, we're still recovering from the Afghanistan war in terms of preparing ourselves for a more peer-to-peer kind of war, and so. Oh, I understand that, but the challenge is procurement takes time, and everybody is in the same line for Stingers, for anti-tank missiles, and all the rest. We can't jump to the line of every weapons procurement that is coming out of other countries, and we don't have the capability for making Stingers, for instance. Thank you.
I'd like to ask you if you can explain to Canadians in terms that the average Canadian would understand why it is important for Canada to continue helping out these war efforts for Ukraine.
Thank you. Let me just say two things quickly. I'm glad to meet you because I'm from the Saint Laurent riding in Montreal.
Oh, nice. My constituent.
And second, I won't say it now, but I'd like to have an opportunity at some point to say things about Trump and NATO and the far right in Russia, because I have an alternative, let's say, even on the drones. But on the question, that's an excellent question. We had the war in Donbass in 2014. It was seen as bad, destabilizing, violation of international law, etc. But the unsaid consensus in the West, so in Canada, in the US, and among the NATO alliance, it was that it was a regional conflict. Illegal, Crimea illegally annexed, but no danger of spilling over. It has to be contained. And the corollary was we're not sending any weapons. Fear of escalation. And then the Minsk protocol, we have to find a diplomatic solution. It didn't work. The qualitative change in 2022, and has been very clear by NATO members, this is a threat. So the full-scale invasion is a threat to international security. It's a threat to European security. Canada is part of the alliance. What that means in simple terms, like to the public, is that Putin will not stop in Ukraine. It will not stop. So the idea is, well, we have to find a ceasefire, just let's stop the war. The war will not stop. Maybe the shooting will stop for a while, and then it will start again. We could say just as the Poles, but okay, they were part of the Warsaw Pact. They've been occupied for 40 years, just as the Estonians. Oh yeah, they used to be in the Soviet Union. They're emotional. Well, why don't we ask the Swedes and the Finns and the Danes and the Dutch and so forth? They have the realization. In the case of Finland and Sweden, they basically overnight put a term to 75 and 200 years of neutrality because they really fear Russian aggression. That would be my answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Arel. I have another question for you. Actually, I had one, but I'll let you go on with what you were going to say to us about Trump and the extreme right.
Le retour de Donald Trump.
Well, the return of Donald Trump would be very, very worrisome. I won't belabor that, both for American democracy and for all of us here in Canada and NATO. But what I do want to say is this. Okay, I read at the debate, he was asked directly last week, will you defend Ukraine? Are you for the defense of Ukraine? He refused to answer that. It's quite clear. It's pretty clear. J.D. Vance is just adding to that by talking about a peace plan, which is essentially the Russian plan, a sort of capitulation of Ukraine, where Ukraine would be demilitarized. What I do want to say is this. the Republican Party today, Trump, seems to have a sort of impunity as to what he can say, as to what he wants to do on about every question, with no pushback from the Republicans themselves, except for one question. And this is empirical. Over the last year, the only question, the only important matter that has divided the Republican Party has been aid to Ukraine. Aid was suspended for 6 months, but it was remarkable is within the Republican Party there was a bit of a revolt, if you will, to switch things so that without having Trump publicly denounce the agreement. So on the issue of what the U.S. should allow for in terms of the use of missiles, the Republicans are divided. And the chairs of committees, that is Defense, Security, Foreign Affairs at the House of Representatives, are all for allowing Ukraine to strike. If Trump resumes power, of course, it's chaos and uncertainty. It's not improbable that on that issue, politics, the policy may change, and that's what Zelensky is counting on. He's meeting Kamala Harris next week, but he's also meeting Trump for the first time. They've never met except once a few years ago at a United Nations meeting. So that is my alternative perspective on this.
Thank you. How about 5 minutes?
Well, it has a split between you and Bazan.
Okay, so that sounds good.
No, just let him Allison, 5 minutes?
Yeah, all right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses, thank you for being here. I'm going to continue along that train of thought first, but I want to get Ms. Kep into the discussion. I asked our witnesses on Tuesday what their thought process was when it came to nuclear threats, and the ambassador said she wasn't concerned. The generals also said that. I just like your take, Ms. Kep, in terms of what you think in terms of, lots of disinformation coming from Russia. So is this just more saber rattling? And, is there some point we should be concerned? We have talked about weapons moving around, and we can come back to that in a second. But I'd just love to have your thoughts on it.
I'll try to be very quick this time. So the nuclear threat conversation. So I'll be honest, I'm not a nuclear deterrence expert. So I look at it from the sort of broader defense analytical perspective. I do not see a very big nuclear risk at the moment. I think there is a lot of conversation. A nuclear threat is something that Russia likes to use every now and then when it wants to affect conversations, opinions, decisions as well. And we are again at that point. And I also want to caution against the fact that really, you need to have a conversation about what it actually is to have, sometimes you'll say, oh, well, use of a tactical nuclear weapon as a deterrent. But you actually have to think about what it means to use a tactical nuclear weapon, where it would be used, how it would be detonated, and what kind of impact it would have, and where. And then you really have the realistic understanding of, is this going to work as a deterrent or escalation or not? So I think that is the sort of part of the conversation that we sometimes forget about, what it actually means in practice.
Thanks. Hey, Sarah, back to you, because we have been talking about it. So at what point do you mentioned there's, as pieces move around the board, we may be concerned, but I just love to have your final thoughts on that.
Again, it's the issue on proliferation or the use of so-called tactical nuclear weapons?
On the use.
On the use of tactical weapons? Yeah. Well, there's a military and alliance component here. The military component, it's not clear what Russia would even gain militarily by using a tactical nuclear weapon in terms of the situation on the battlefield. But it would then, the political effect of basically breaking the taboo the first time since 1945 would be enormous. Now, enormous in terms of the reaction of NATO. Radosław Sikorski has been very explicit about apparently what NATO would do. It's basically a complete, massive, conventional attack on any Russian positions in legal Ukrainian territory. Okay. But also in terms of Russian alliances, there's not that many and relatively isolated. The one thing that China has said that is not inclined towards Russia since the beginning of the war is don't do it. And they've said that publicly, and it's on their peace plan that dates from February 2023. Don't use nuclear weapons. Well, of course, they use a different diplomatic language, but the message was very clear. So the cost, the military gain is questionable. The political, the military cost might be huge coming from NATO, but then the diplomatic and then alliance, and therefore also in terms of supply chain, a lot is coming from China that has dual use, might be too high for the Russians, would be my understanding.
Thanks. Go ahead.
I'll just in that last minute, I'll take Mr. Ellison's last minute. Professor Ariel, you talked about Russian artillery is now outpace all of NATO combined. We also know that they're getting munitions from North Korea and drones and missiles from Iran. How far back is NATO allies, and how can Canada do more to help supplement that production of artillery shells and rockets?
The gap is considerable.
Like, you got a number? Can you quantify?
With all due respect, I don't see any shift in Canadian policy on that front. Zero. There's been shifts in Europe, but it takes time to restart that kind of production. It was kind of the peace benefit of the end of the Cold War. NATO prepared for a war that never happened, except it happened 25 years later. A high-intensity conventional warfare without that kind of capability. Because we didn't think, the NATO coalition never thought that a war that looks like World War II in terms of how it's conducted on the ground, minus the drones, would occur again. So here what we see in Europe is a variation in the political will to really engage medium and long term, because short term is really, really difficult to match we have to say, remarkable capabilities of Russian production here.
We're going to have to leave the question and answer there.
I note the other thing you said, Mr. Sederman, which I found kind of a little bit shocking, is you suggested that our deployment of 1,600 troops in Latvia is not sustainable. We're a country of 40 million people. I kind of say, what, 1,600 people? We don't have the resources to sustain that? Now, you did mention the possibility of bringing over families and the fact that it wasn't an attractive posting. Do you want to just comment more on our military readiness if we can't maintain 1,600 troops overseas?
Question. And he's giving you 7 seconds to answer it. Possibly you could work it into a response, because I think everyone in the room is interested in it. That brings to a close our second round. Now, I know there's some enthusiasm, 25 minutes. I know you. So, Suzanne, 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, so, Mr. Saban, you talked about taking what we have and that, like tanks and armored vehicles and just give them to Ukraine. Back in 2022, March 22, after the hot war broke out and full-scale invasion, Conservatives called on the government to donate our surplus labs. And then we put an order paper question in. The government said that they had 62 that were repairable and could be overhauled in 220 days and sent. Never happened. Now they announced that they're just sending over I think it's 60-some labs that are just being sent for spare parts. Wouldn't it have been better to send them 2 years ago when they were still operational than leaving them till they were completely unusable as a fighting machine other than spare parts for equipment they already got there? Would have saved lives, wouldn't it?
I can't speak to the specifics of those 62 labs. Obviously, more in the hands of the Ukrainians sooner is better.
You weren't advocating, though, you say to take our old tanks that we got, because I think we're down to 56 that are actually still left here that can be trained on. A lot of them aren't fit for purpose anymore. You're saying donate them, let them use them, but you're not advocating that Canada doesn't get rid of its tanks, are you? Because one thing we've learned in Ukraine, it's a tank war.
I think some of our allies have made the decision that it'd be better to be having them used to fight the Russians now than to fight the Russians later. And so the idea of giving them to the Ukrainians to stop the Russian war, to win the war with Russia now, is better than waiting 5 or 10 years for us to use them in Latvia. So that is a difficult political calculation, but it's something we should take seriously. I don't think it's going to happen because it is a risky decision, and it would make it difficult for us to train our tankers. But again, our military on a regular basis has revisited the tank decision about whether to have tanks or not. And if our allies have tanks, is it that important for us to have it? It depends on how comfortable we are with relying on our allies. Allies can be more or less reliable. I've written a book about that. And so as long as we're fighting alongside the Americans, things are pretty good. If we're fighting alongside the Italians,
and that's the case.
Yeah, and that's the case.
That historically, Canada's always had the ability to pull out a full complement of armory along with our army. You know, same as the howitzers, the 777s. Like, shouldn't we be replacing those and send the rest that we got to Ukraine and investing in new howitzers for Canada?
The challenge is everybody's learned how valuable these things are, and I'm sure you know that it takes a while to procure things, and so how long would the gap be between us shipping everything off? So I could see why the Army doesn't want to ship off everything and then wait 10 years for the new tanks and the new howitzers. And the problem is the production lines. Everybody wants the same stuff, so it's not like we can actually, even if we made fast decisions, the stuff is not on a shelf somewhere in surplus.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Sederman, I want to pick up where Ms. Matheson left off with some of her questions earlier around disinformation. And so I was fascinated with your comments regarding Trump, and I've watched with some fascination in terms of what's happening around the world with disinformation. And retired General Eyre warned our committee several times in his appearances here, sitting in the same chair you're sitting in, sir, about disinformation and its impact on our institutions, including the Canadian Armed Forces, but as well as our democratic institutions and our allies as well. And Russia has been very vocal and has bragged publicly about those efforts. Margarita Simonian from RT television has talked about how successful those campaigns have been. And of course, the Department of Justice last week outed 3 very influential right-wing social media personalities in terms of having received $10 million from Russia. And so with all that said, and with all the things that you talked about with Vice President nominee Vance and President Trump's efforts, it's having an impact. That those disinformation campaigns are having an impact, right? They sway, they influence public opinion, and public opinion then drives political characters to make different decisions. And we're seeing that with MAGA. We're seeing that with the Make Canada Great Again movement that we see with the leader of the official opposition who's pulled his support for Ukraine. And we've seen it in the EU elections. And so, you know, and it's a 50-50 right now, former President Trump is elected, and that support then is pulled from NATO because of, in part, those disinformation campaigns. Where do we go from there, so to speak, in terms of combating what we know is happening? And we haven't shone a lot of light on it, although the DOJ, I think, information last week was very revealing. How do we as a society and as a government deal with those efforts, knowing that they're having an impact on public opinion and they're swaying political representatives to make some very crazy decisions?
Well, it's a really challenging problem. We've known this not for a week, but we've known for 8 years that the investigation into Trump's 2016 campaign. We know this about Brexit, that there are Russian influence on that. It requires, again, as I said, it requires greater clarity from the media about where the information is coming from, to be more careful about repeating false information. I'm as guilty as anyone on social media of, reposting something that I see without really investigating it. We have to have better discipline about figuring out what these stories are and how do we report them. So to give you the example of the Haitian immigrant story, it's entirely baseless, but just talking about it helps to amplify it, right? And so how do we talk about the thing that's been coming up and educate the publics about it in ways that undermine the disinformation campaign. So Canada has invested in academics studying this stuff. I've got good friends of mine who are disinformation experts. They faced lawsuits from the far right to silence them. The good news about the stuff last week is the lawsuits are going to be harder to win by the folks who are suing them, because they can say, the exact people that were identified in network analysis of Twitter, all is just, this bit of last week's news helps to provide evidence that all these things we've been saying thus far are true.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Don't believe anything about cats and dogs. 1 minute. Madame Normandin.
Rapidement, Monsieur Harel, sur l'accession éventuelle.
Quickly, Mr. Arel, on Ukraine's accession to NATO, you referred to the legal system that had to be looked at. It's a democracy, but not fully liberal democracy. What needs to be looked at there post-war? Accession to NATO and to European Union would be done in parallel. Of course, in Ukraine, the Achilles heel is the weakness of the rule of law, the lack of institutional independence, the Court of Justice. On the issue of corruption, that was prior to the war of 2022. The Allies worked really hard to help Ukrainians set up anti-corruption systems, and their response was, given the fact that the legal system is corrupt, you have to have a parallel justice system that is anti-corrupt to cover all the bases. Progress has been made. What's remarkable also is that the political system has been, if you will, suspended because of the war in Ukraine, but oligarchs, the oligarchs that were corroding, if you will, the system have lost most of their rights. So something has fundamentally changed. That said, ultimately, it's always a political decision. It's not about checking all the boxes. It's a political decision.
I'm going to just ask to our RAND specialist, Ms. Keep. You are a specialist on the Baltics, and we see all the saber rattling. We talk about Russia, but we also know that Belarus has now taken on nuclear weapons from Russia, that they have, there's ADPAD exercises that they've been doing extensively with Russian forces, as well as I believe that there was Cuban forces last year that were part of those exercises along the Latvian and Polish borders. What do you assess the threat level at from Belarus as proxy for Russia to offset the threat environment in both the Baltics as well as in Ukraine?
Thank you. Well, in addition to the examples that you mentioned, the really important one is essentially we've seen a trend of Belarus and Russia integrating military closer and closer, and that has been also supported by official agreements as well. So from a defense planning and threat assessment point of view, I would treat Belarus and Russia together as a threat. So really when we see as a threat from the conventional military side, but also as a similar sort of cooperative threat also from the hybrid types of threats, right? We see that from the point of view of exercises, military integration and cooperation. We see that also from the point of view of hybrid threats, the forced migration activities that have been going through Belarusian territory as well.
So when we look at the Russian drone that ended up in Latvia, do you believe that I'm sure the Russians are saying, no, it just flew off course, but do you think that maybe it was done accidentally on purpose to test the response of NATO allies, and particularly the enhanced forward position that Canada leads in Latvia?
So I actually haven't seen any Russian statements about what exactly happened. So investigation is still ongoing. Even the Baltic officials have different sort of opinions on what really happened. I think no one really thinks that it was done on purpose. There are some conversation that it may have been let's say, the drone was intended for Ukraine, and that there was a really big targeting problem that happened. That is why it's either crash landed or landed in the territory of Latvia. So we still have to, let's say, I will wait for the investigation. It could be a malfunction. It could also be, I mean, you cannot waste a good crisis. So it does serve as a way for Russia to see what is happening, what are the reactions on the political side, but also on the sort of tactics and procedures that the Baltics nationally, but also NATO uses to respond to these threats.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan.
The ambassador of Ukraine was here during our last committee and talked about, when we asked her, is a path towards a NATO membership. That's been Ukraine's, ask of all our allied country. Could you maybe tell me or tell us, how do you see this going forward, and how would that look like with the possibility of a Trump president? And I would certainly appreciate to hear from the three of you.
The challenge is that Article 5 means an attack upon one equals an attack upon all. So NATO's position has been not to allow in countries that are currently at war. In the 1990s and early 2000s membership processes, there was pressure for all of the aspirants to settle their border disputes. What's going on now is far more than a border dispute. So the war has to end before Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. Then when that happens, I think it would be a very short path, because we would like to avoid having a future war in Ukraine. So I think it would, there are all the other conditions, but as my colleague suggested, really, the conditions themselves don't really matter. The whole paper process is about whether the alliance can get consensus. And until the war is over, there will be no consensus. Now, we're forgetting that Trump's first impeachment was about trying to extort Zelensky to get information on Biden. So I don't think that a Trump-led government would agree to Ukrainian membership. That, again, we need consensus, and if the United States does not join the consensus, there is no consensus.
Okay. Je peux répondre en français?
S'il vous plaît.
Oui. C'est pas tellement différent de ce que Stephen a dit.
I won't stray much from what Stephen just said, but the challenge is not NATO membership. It's the idea of NATO being able to defend Ukraine, those security guarantees. First, you have to be at a situation where Russia can no longer attack Ukraine. And when you're talking about negotiations, that's an issue that's always outstanding. It was already outstanding in Istanbul. What are these security guarantees? It means that Russia can no longer attack us, cannot attack us, not because American soldiers are going to defend us, but because we are already equipped through NATO and our own industry to make sure that the costs of an attack would be excessive for Russia. Once you pass that stage, I mean, that's the toughest part. Then the question of whether Ukraine can join NATO.